How did you first become interested in working at a planetarium?
Oh, I would probably say it was in college. I went to undergraduate at University of Washington, and they had a small planetarium there, and I was taking a bunch of physics classes, but I thought all the cool stuff was out in space, and so I was able to add on an astronomy major, and so um, they had a very small planetarium, and they trained me on it, and they let me actually do small school group shows. It was very small. We could only fit about one class in there at a time. And it was just such an awesome experience to be able to hang out in the dark and talk about the stars and actually learn them. Because I think there's somewhat of a hidden secret that today when you're an astronomer, you're dealing with the physics side of things. You're an astrophysicist really, and you're talking about the physics of disks and how disks form, or how large-scale structure forms in the universe, or the temperature and pressure in stars, and all of these things that just sort of sitting there and knowing the constellations is a lot harder. It's not something that people do as much anymore. And so I didn't have a lot of experience with that. I didn't know my constellations, but I got to hang out in this really cool room almost any time I wanted and just look at the stars and learn those, and that was a really fun experience, and I could see the wonder and awe in the kids that I was teaching and talking to them about, and there's just something so exciting about helping people connect with space that I realized that I think that's where it started, and it wasn't really until grad school that I realized that's where I really wanted my career to go, but yeah, that's where I started.
Was that your first time going to a planetarium?
No, I know I went when I was a kid. I think I've been a couple times to one as a kid. So I remember going to the Pacific Science Center's planetarium at one point. I think it was for a laser show of some kind. That's what I remember. And then I remember going on some sort of field trip when I was a kid to a camp of some kind, and they had a planetarium. And I remember seeing the stars. And I remember thinking both times it was really cool, but it was never something that was like, oh, I want that to be my job. But when I actually got to work with one and experience the teaching side, that's, I think, when it finally connected.
And I saw online that you had an internship before at Adler Planetarium.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like?
Oh, that was fantastic. And I missed my time there. I was only there for 3 months, and it was definitely not long enough. And that's a really interesting place to be. It's very different than most other planetariums in that it's planetariums and astronomy museum. So I'm also very much a museum nerd and museum geek, and I love museums and talking about museum theory and how do we structure exhibits and engage visitors in different ways. And so there's that aspect of it, and then there's also 2 different domes that you could go in that gave you different types of shows to watch, plus a 3D theater. And so there's all these different ways of engaging people, plus they have a lot of fantastic programming on top of that. And where I work specifically at the Adler was the Space Visualization Lab. So this is where they brought in the scientists, either the astronomers that actually work at Adler or the University of Chicago or Northwestern, to come talk about their research with the general public. But they also had a bunch of different pieces of technological tools in order to help people visualize what's out in space and think about it in different ways. Be it a touch table of some kind, or a 3D panorama of Mars or the moon, or 3-dimensional models of supernova exploding, or a connect where you could actually swim through the universe, is how I always described it. And that's what we kind of need in astronomy. We don't have a lot of actual artifacts. We have meteorites, we have some telescopes, and they have one of the best collections of like antique astronomy tools. But when it comes to the actual stars, we don't have a lot that we can just show people. And so it's a matter of finding new ways of visualizing that. And so it really taught me a lot in terms, and helped me think about what it means to teach astronomy in informal learning settings and in museums, and what we do and how that's different from other museums, like a natural history museum with millions of specimens and like floors of collections. We don't have that in astronomy. So what does that mean, and how are we similar and how are we different in terms of learning?
Then you still see the planetarium as a kind of museum?
I do. There are similarities and there are differences. Take a break. So, we're still informal learning institutions, and we are very similar in that we can engage and excite people with something that in its own way is still authentic, in that we can, even though we are recreating the night sky, we don't have an authentic object for people to necessarily touch and look at and awe in like a museum would, but we are recreating a fairly authentic night sky where we can have people actually engage in data collection, and there's sort of an authentic scientific practice that goes into what you're doing and the observations that you can make in the planetarium. So we are different though in that we are a little more structured in terms of how people come visit us, whereas a museum you go out and you're like, I want to go see this and I'm going to stay here for 10 minutes and oh that's really interesting, and you can move around however you want. Planetariums, it's you go into the theater, you sit in there for an hour and we're talking to you. Now we can make that interactive, we can make that engaging, we can talk to you and have a conversation, but you're still sitting in one spot. And that sort of individual choice kind of goes away, because one person might choose that they want to ask something and they ask it, now everyone else is brought into that as well. So that experience is slightly different, but we're still a really engaging and fun place to go to learn. And in that sense, we're still very similar, in a lot of what we know about how people learn in museums still applies. So.
What was the first thing that drew you to the Abrams Planetarium?
Aside from there was a job posting when I was a graduate student and graduating and needing a job, that was part of it. But I think what ultimately drew me here was this is a fairly unique place. It's a long-standing planetarium. We are now over 53 years old, or about 53 years old, from when we opened. The building's a little bit older than that. And so it's this long-standing institution that has a lot of history. And I think even before I got the job, I didn't know this full history or even realize that it was here. But once I got here and interviewed and started talking to people and dug into it, I realized that this is a very old institution. It was the place where things like the Great Lakes Planetarium Association and the International Planetarium Society started. And those are two amazingly huge and wonderful organizations for planetarians to continue learning from each other. And it's a very open and welcoming community at that. And to think that those have some of their start, at least here, is fantastic. And I actually went to my very first IPS conference in Poland this summer, and I'm like, wow, the first one technically started at our planetarium. That's amazing. So there's this rich history there. There's also the sky calendar we produce, and that is a fantastic resource for people who want to just know what to look for outside. And it's fairly easy to use. It's like, here's a box of the sky for this date, look outside at this time, this is what you're going to see, this is what's really important and interesting to look at. And this is a fairly ubiquitous thing that I have known for probably 15 years, since I really became an astronomy major. We had subscriptions to it as undergraduates, and I would see them around. We had one right outside the planetarium in grad school. So I'd always see this thing, and I saw Abrams Planetarium on it, but I didn't really connect it in any way. Like, oh, that's the thing that everyone has. And then I get here, I'm like, oh, this is the place that produces it. That's really cool. And now I'm part of editing and doing things like that. I don't write it, John does, but I at least go through and look for typos and things like that. So it's just, there's a really rich history there. And then on top of that, even there used to be a master's program in the 70s for people wanting to go into planetariums, like how do you actually use planetariums and learn that. That was here, and people still have that connection. And so I think there is very much this rich history here, when in terms of the history of planetarium specifically, that is really appealing. And even as I stay here longer, I hear more and more. But beyond that, what's really nice about this planetarium is that it's a standalone planetarium. Most of the ones that you have out there are attached to a museum or a science center in some way. They are And so to some extent you don't have as much freedom necessarily to do what you want to do. There's probably going to be some, and every institution's different, but we have a lot of freedom here to actually explore and see what we can do with the planetarium. And yes, we're technically an outreach branch of the physics department at Michigan State University, but they also give us a lot of support and freedom to do that exploration. And all the other planetariums I've been in before that are either very much more museum based or attached to something, or they're the outreach component of a department, or they're there for teaching for a department, but they're much smaller, so there's limitations in what you can do with that. So here we've really been able to kind of spread our wings a little bit, and I feel like I've been allowed to spread my wings a little bit, and we get to, especially with the new system we have, we get to explore the future of planetariums and what does it mean to be a planetarium from here on out. Are we going to focus on astronomy? Are we going to be able to bring in other content areas? Because we can technically do that. We can do that with the system and the software. Is that the direction we want to go? And if so, how do we do that while still sort of maintaining our identity as an astronomy education resource? And so there's, I think, some big questions in the field, and it's really exciting to be at a place that has, again, that history, but that we can also explore that future. So.
Do you remember your first day working here?
Yes.
What was it like?
It was busy. I got here, it was a pretty rainy day. I remember that. It was like the very first day was like orientation stuff. So I think I came in, I'm like, here's my office. I brought a few things in, I'm like, hooray. And then I had to go down to HR, and I didn't know where I was going, and it seemed really far away. So I went there for my orientation. I'm like, oh, I'll just walk back. It's not that far. And then it was a long walk, and then it started pouring. And so I'm like hiding out in the engineering college for a while. And like I was wearing not so great shoes that day that were eating my feet up. Like it was it was not like the first day of like, yay, this place is amazing. It was like,